pandemic, I've tried to take a comparative approach because too often American policy is undermined by a number of phenomena, a number of mistakes which repeat consistently. Sometimes we allow ourselves to calibrate American policy towards wishful thinking. We don't want to admit what's going on. We don't want to recognize the reality. And therefore, we just close our eyes and hope for the best. Sometimes we actively calibrate our policy to the past as well. For too long, for example, in Turkey, we pretended that Turkey was no different under Recep Tayyip Erdogan than it was under many other prime ministers before. And of course, the first rule of holes is when you're in a hole, stop digging. But if we embrace our wishful thinking, then we actually make the matter 10 times worse. Let me just talk very briefly about why I worry so much about Bangladesh today. I worry because I see in Bangladesh many of the same patterns which I've seen with regard to Iran and with regard to Turkey as well. I was only 7 years old at the time, so I'm reading this now after the fact. But of course, many of you remember that in 1978, Ayatollah Khomeini was in exile. For the last year of his exile, he was at a chateau outside of Paris. And when he was outside of Paris, he met with reporters almost every single day. Reporters from the Associated Press, reporters from the Washington Post, the New York Times, from Austrian newspapers, from French newspapers, and so forth. And he would say wonderful things. I have no interest in personal power. All I want to do is unseat the dictator and then usher in a new democracy. And indeed, many Iranians bought the rhetoric. And what many people forget, 1% of Americans took part in our American Revolution. 2% of Frenchmen or Russians took part in the French Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution. A full 10% of Iranians took part in the Islamic Revolution in 1979. They were united in what they were against. They were against the Shah at the time, whom they saw as too much of a dictator. But they didn't necessarily agree on a platform moving forward. And Ayatollah Khomeini played them masterfully. He said, I believe in an Islamic democracy. He never explained what that meant. But by the time he seized power, he started consolidating power. One of the economists, a liberal left-leaning economist who he had embraced, Abu Hassan Bani Sadr, was soon exiled to Paris because he was no longer useful. He had already done his function, which was convince the West that this was a revolution about human rights, a revolution about democracy. But by that point, it really was too late. Now, I'm going to talk about Turkey in a moment, but I want to bring up one other issue where I see history repeating. You know the famous Supreme Court Justice, Potter Stewart, when he spoke about pornography in a famous court case about obscenity, he gave a famous brief in which he said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. In international relations, terrorism is much the same thing. There is no international consensus definition of terror, which also allows for rhetorical games, where everyone can say they are against terrorism, but unless it happens to be for a cause with which they agree. And therefore, we get ironies. Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey saying he's against terror, even as he sponsors Hamas. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, saying he's against terror, even as he sponsors Hezbollah and the Houthis. And we see this also repeating. Now, the other issue with regard to terrorism, when the United States confronts it, it can be very hard to deal with terror for two things because of the way American policymakers across administrations tie our hands together. We have a separation of church and state. We have a separation of mosque and state. Therefore, we want to project that mindset onto our policy. We don't want to have to address an ideology which is behind some religious interpretations. In fact, too often criticizing religious interpretations is seen as, for example, when it comes to Islam, somehow Islamophobic. Now, I spend a lot of my time in my job at the American Enterprise Institute and the Middle East Forum is basically to embed myself with those who are adversaries to the United States, to go to places where the US government can't go, and to figure out how people on the ground think. Now, first of all, let me say both American Enterprise Institute and Middle East Forum are nonprofits. I receive a salary. Neither of them take government money from any government, including the US government, nor do I accept money from anyone else. I call things as I see them. And when people suggest that calling things as you see them is somehow indicative that you must be somehow on the take, that's projection. That's an indication that they are on the take. Why does one write about Bangladesh? It's because it's in a crisis right now, a crisis of Jamaat Islami and Mohammad Yunus's own making. No other explanation than that. It's that simple. Now, when it comes to religion, like I said, I spend a lot of my time, for example, in Iraq and in southern Lebanon. Soon after the Islamic State was defeated, I was in Raqqa, the capital of the Islamic State, right after liberation. And when I'm talking to people, they're not saying that criticism of the Islamic State is somehow Islamophobic. What they're saying is theologically, we have a problem within Islam. There is a theological debate. And the people who do most of the dying at the hands of radical Islamists aren't Jews, aren't Christians, aren't Hindus, they're fellow Muslims themselves. The people that were getting thrown off the buildings by the Islamic State for allegedly being gay, or murdered for smoking a cigarette or watching a football game, most of those were moderate Muslims. Likewise, in Afghanistan, so-called green on blue violence, where people we were training would turn their guns on their NATO trainers, what we often forgot is the rate of green on green violence was 3 times as high. When Joe Biden and Jake Sullivan said the Afghans didn't fight for their freedom, let's not forget something like 30, 40, 50,000 Afghan national security forces died for their freedom, fighting the Taliban. And so this notion that somehow it is against Islam to criticize the extremist trends in theology is ironic. I mean, I always found it ironic also in the United States that criticisms that some people say are Islamophobic, people talk openly about. Muslim communities in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and so forth, talk openly about without having that stigma. That stigma exists simply to try to shut down debate. Now, when it comes to Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is also someone that can be instructive as to history. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, of course, became a leading figure. And when I look at Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the one figure which I think best explains Recep Tayyip Erdogan's program, and it comes from Turkey's own interior ministry, is that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, under him, the murder rate of women inside Turkey has increased 1,400%. That's a Turkish interior ministry statistic. Now, Recep Tayyip Erdogan famously said, I am the Imam of Istanbul. I am the servant of Sharia. The Turkish army is the army of Muhammad. But then people said, no, 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 he changed. Never mind, he said, democracy is like a streetcar. You ride it as far as you need and then you step off. Now, European liberals, American liberals and progressives wanted to embrace Recep Tayyip Erdogan. They wanted to believe that he really was in favor of democracy because he used the rhetoric of democracy. They actually said, for example, we need to unwind the constitutional controls of the Turkish military because that's undemocratic, but they never created another check and balance. And when you undo a check and balance, then you allow the ideologues to push right through. Back to terrorism. Another problem we have in the United States is we look at terrorism as a grievance. It was because of a dictatorship. It's because of occupation. It's because of a lack of education or lack of employment. And if only we resolve those, terrorism goes away. No, it's about ideology, and we need to confront that ideology head on. Now, there are other certain warning signs as I conclude my talk, which I think we need to address. Number one, religious freedom is the canary in the coal mine. You can't have democratic reform and stage pogroms against Hindus. You can't have democratic reform and kill Christians. It simply is not possible. There is not a single example on earth. You can be a naive economist. You can bear a personal grudge and talk the right talk to the West, but that doesn't mean you're a Democrat. At best, it means you're a useful idiot. Now, the other thing we need to worry about is not only the arrest of politicians like 𝗤𝗙𝗪𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀, who had turned his district into a haven for Hindus. We also need to understand when you arrest journalists like Farzan Rupa or Shahil Ahmed, the only reason you're silencing journalists is because you can't address the criticisms they're making. You're afraid that they're going to actually criticize your own interim government, your own unelected government. And that too is a warning sign along with religious freedom. No journalist committed murder. And the fact that you're so over the top and you live in such an echo chamber as to believe this shows that the situation is 10 times worse than many people in the West are led to believe. Now, we've talked a lot about history, and we started with a moment of silence about the genocide in 1971. We need to understand, for example, when it came to 𝗤𝗏𝗍𝗔 𝗟𝗏, it was the only group outside of the Nazis that had ever been systematically went through a judicial process for its complicity in such genocide. You know, you can pretend that you're reformed, but a reformed al-Qaeda is still al-Qaeda. A reformed war criminal is still a war criminal. And if we want to look at the situation objectively, pushing forward, then there really is no choice for the United States. We need to apply global Magnitsky Act sanctions to Mohammad Yunus for the crimes he's committing against the Bangladeshi people, against journalists, and against religious figures. Being a Nobel laureate does not give you carte blanche to become a war criminal. That was not the case with Abiy Ahmed, who is guilty of genocide in Tigray. It's not the case with Aung San Suu Kyi. The fact of the matter is that Mohammad Yunus needs to be judged by his actions, not an award he received almost 20 years ago. That's number one. Number two, we've got to recognize 𝗤𝗏𝗍𝗔 𝗟𝗏 for what it is. When you're springing al-Qaeda from power, when you're targeting minorities, when you're staging pogroms, when that is your platform, when you're liaising with al-Qaeda and other figures, with 𝗥𝗘𝗙𝗪𝗀𝗏, then you are a terrorist group. And the best thing the United States can do in a bipartisan fashion is to designate 𝗤𝗏𝗍𝗏 𝗟𝗏 as a foreign terrorist organization. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to apologize that I can't stick around for longer. My wife is traveling and I need to get back to my kids. But I want to applaud you for what you're doing, for your advocacy, and keep up the good fight. Thank you.